And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
Princess Anne had spent decades protecting the crown by choosing silence over spectacle. But this time, she did something almost unimaginable. With Charles listening, William visibly frozen, and senior members of the family caught completely off guard, Anne spoke Diana's name, and then delivered a sentence powerful enough to reopen wounds the monarchy had spent nearly 30 years trying to contain. She did not defend the institution. She defended the woman whose absence had never truly disappeared. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had always been known for discipline, restraint, and an ability to separate private feeling from royal duty. That mattered because the royal family, the circle of senior relatives carrying responsibilities for the monarchy, had survived crisis by controlling what was said, when it was said, and how much emotion reached the public. She rarely challenged that instinct. Yet, at a commemorative gathering at Windsor, the king watched his sister abandon it completely. Anne leaned into the silence and said the words without hesitation. "Diana is the woman this family has never stopped loving." No qualification followed. No attempt came to soften the meaning. William lowered his eyes and pressed his lips together, because hearing his aunt speak about his mother with such certainty struck beyond royal history. The prince had spent years carrying Diana through charity work, family memories, and the way he raised his children. But this was different. Someone inside the family had finally said aloud what he had long felt was buried beneath careful language. Charles did not interrupt. The monarch sat several seats away, caught between his role as king and memories belonging to a painful chapter of his life. Anne looked toward her brother, and the pause became almost unbearable. She had not said William loved Diana. She had not said Harry loved her. She had said this family. That single choice widened the meaning to include people who had rarely admitted how deeply the late princess still lived inside their private history. An aide tried to move the discussion forward, but Anne refused to let the moment disappear. She placed one hand on the table and said the family had spent too many years acting as though remembrance had to be politically convenient. William looked up then, studying her face, and something changed in his expression. The words had not been spontaneous. His aunt had arrived carrying a decision. Anne had broken the silence, but to understand why those words shook William, unsettled Charles, and changed the mood inside Windsor, the people carrying Diana's memory had to be understood first. The same name meant something different to every person in that room. To William, Diana was his mother, the voice, touch, and protection stolen from him too early. To Charles, she belonged to a chapter filled with love, failure, conflict, and consequences that could never be rewritten. But to Anne, Diana represented something more complicated. A woman who collided with the monarchy, challenged it, wounded it, changed it, and somehow remained woven into the family long after death. William carried that history more personally than anyone around him could fully understand. Diana was not simply part of royal memory. She was tied to childhood, grief, and the pressure of growing up before millions of strangers. The prince had spent years trying to give George, Charlotte, and Louis something he had lost too early, a sense that family should feel safe before it ever feels royal. That mattered because every conversation about his mother eventually became a conversation about the father he wanted to be. Anne understood a different part of the pain. She and Diana had never approached royal life in the same way, but both had lived under relentless scrutiny, and both knew how lonely duty could become. Royal duty, the expectation that senior family members carry public responsibilities on behalf of the crown, could look polished from the outside, while demanding enormous private sacrifice. Anne had survived by controlling emotion. Diana had often survived by expressing it. Their differences had been obvious, but so had the pressure surrounding them. William caught up with his aunt after the gathering and asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Why those words?" he said. Anne studied him before answering, and the pause felt heavier than the sentence itself. She told him that some truths became more painful the longer everyone avoided them. The prince did not respond immediately. He knew she was not speaking only about grief. She was speaking about the family's habit of turning memory into something carefully managed. Charles remained behind. He picked up his glasses, set them down again, and stared toward the chair his son had just left. The king had learned to keep Diana inside a controlled part of his memory because almost every mention of her invited judgment about his past. Yet Anne's statement had broken that control. His former wife was suddenly not being discussed as history, scandal, or tragedy. She was being described as someone still loved. Anne then told William something even harder. Diana's name, she said, still changed conversations even when nobody spoke it. Ceremonies, charity, parenting, public affection, jewelry, and the image of the monarchy were still measured against what she had represented. The future king asked whether Charles had known the statement was coming. His aunt answered immediately, no. She believed warning him would have turned a human truth into another managed palace response. Then Anne gave William the reason he had not expected. Her words had been triggered by a private Windsor exchange only days earlier, when the family had discussed how Diana should be remembered at an upcoming commemoration. One small decision had crossed a line. That private exchange would become the hidden fuse beneath Anne's statement, because what happened at Windsor had pushed years of buried emotion dangerously close to the surface. Anne's declaration had sounded sudden. It was not. 3 days earlier, behind a closed door at Windsor, a conversation about Diana's place in an upcoming family commemoration had gone disastrously wrong. What began as a discussion about tone became an argument about memory. What began as protocol became personal. By the time Anne left that room, she had heard enough to convince her that silence was no longer protecting the monarchy. It was beginning to erase something the family still carried. William had entered that earlier meeting, expecting a simple discussion about remembrance. The family commemoration was meant to honor deceased members of the House of Windsor, the royal family line and institution built around the reigning monarch, and he wanted Diana acknowledged as more than a passing name. For the prince, that mattered deeply. His mother was not a footnote inside royal history. She was part of the emotional foundation of his life, and reducing her presence to formal wording felt like another way of keeping her at a distance. Charles understood the danger differently. Every public mention of Diana still carried the power to reopen arguments about marriage, betrayal, grief, and the monarchy's treatment of her. The king wanted the gathering to remain personal, rather than become another national judgment on the past. Anne initially said little, watching her brother choose each word carefully, while William grew more frustrated with every attempt to make remembrance safer. William finally pushed back. His chair moved away from the table, and his voice hardened as he told Charles that his mother could not be treated like a communications problem. The prince believed something simple was being lost beneath palace caution. Diana had been loved, she had been hurt, and she had remained his mother regardless of what later history decided about her. Charles answered that he was trying to protect the family from another cycle of public conflict, but even he seemed to hear how defensive the words sounded. Anne felt the argument changing. She could see her brother speaking as king while remembering as a former husband, and she could see William speaking as a future monarch while hurting as a son. Neither man was saying what truly mattered. Then the proposal that changed everything was placed before them. Diana would receive only a brief written reference, with no spoken family tribute. William went completely silent. Anne did not. She asked who had decided that saying Diana's name aloud had become too dangerous. Charles did not answer immediately, and that hesitation told her enough. The princess understood then that caution had crossed into avoidance. Anne waited until the room began to empty before speaking privately to her brother. She told Charles that avoiding Diana had never removed her from the family. It had only made her absence louder. The king did not challenge the words, but he still stopped short of approving the stronger tribute. Anne left Windsor with one conclusion burning inside her. The next conversation could not end the same way. 3 days later, when Diana's place was raised again, she said the sentence that stunned the room, and Charles knew instantly what had caused it. But once those words were spoken, the question was no longer whether Diana should be remembered, it was whether Charles could face Anne and William after realizing why they believed the family had failed to say her name. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Charles did not summon advisors. Anne did not ask for support. Within hours of her statement, brother and sister stood face to face with decades of family history pressing between them. His question was restrained but unmistakably wounded. Why had she spoken for the entire family? Anne's response cut deeper. Because, she told him, everyone had spent too long pretending that loving Diana and surviving what happened could not exist at the same time. Charles asked his sister to meet privately at Windsor before the day could move any further. No communications team waited nearby, because this was not about official policy or a public statement. The king wanted to know whether Anne believed she had the right to describe feelings that belonged to people who had lived through Diana in very different ways. That mattered, because every word about his former marriage still carried the power to reopen old judgments, not only about him, but about the monarchy itself. Anne understood exactly why he was angry. Her sentence could easily be heard as a verdict on the past, on his failures, and on the way Diana had been treated inside the family. But she refused to let that fear control the conversation. The princess had not spoken to punish her brother. She had spoken because she believed years of careful silence had created a false choice: either respect the present, or admit there had once been love. Charles closed the door himself. He turned toward her and asked, "Why did you say it like that?" Anne did not sit. She stayed where she was and answered that she had chosen every word deliberately. The king reminded her that she had spoken for everyone. His sister replied that she had spoken about something the family had been living with for decades, even when nobody wanted to name it. Anne then made the distinction that stopped him cold. She was not accusing Charles of refusing to move forward. She was accusing the family of acting as though moving forward required emotional amnesia. The monarch turned away. He had built a new life, carried the crown, and learned to survive endless comparison with the past. Yet none of that had erased Diana. Charles finally admitted it. William could sometimes make the past return with a look, a phrase, or a choice that reminded him of his mother. Family ceremonies could do the same. Even moments involving the grandchildren could unexpectedly reopen memories the king believed he had placed somewhere safe. Anne did not soften. She told him that was exactly why she had used the word loving. Families did not grieve in neat categories. Pain could survive beside tenderness. Anger could exist beside affection. Guilt, loss, memory, and love could all occupy the same history. Charles looked back at her and asked one final question. Had William known what she intended to say? Anne answered no. That changed everything. The argument between brother and sister had exposed the wound, but the real struggle now belonged to the two men whose lives had been shaped most brutally by Diana's absence. Diana had been gone for decades, yet her place inside the monarchy still carried extraordinary power. Charles held the crown. William carried her blood, memories, and public legacy. Anne had now claimed the moral freedom to speak her name without permission. And suddenly, an uncomfortable question sat at the center of the family. Who decides how Diana is remembered? The king who survived their broken marriage, the son who lost his mother, or a family finally admitting that neither history nor protocol could contain her? Charles possessed the institutional authority of the monarch, meaning the person who formally leads the royal family and carries the crown's public responsibilities. But Diana's memory did not belong to an office. William carried something no title could override: the private bond of a son whose identity had been shaped by losing his mother too young. The prince was also the future king, which made that grief impossible to separate from the monarchy's future. Anne stood somewhere between them. She was not fighting for control, succession, or ownership of Diana's legacy. That gave her a freedom neither man fully possessed. She could say what Charles might consider politically dangerous, and what William might find too painful to say himself. The princess had become powerful in this moment precisely because she was not asking for power. William felt that tension immediately when a senior aide began explaining how Anne's statement could dominate coverage. The conversation quickly turned toward headlines, reaction, and reputational risk. The prince removed his glasses and stopped the briefing. He said his mother's name was not a crisis to be managed. If the family treated every mention of Diana as a threat, then nothing had truly changed. Charles faced the same words alone. He read a prepared summary of the reaction and reached the sentence quoting his sister. The king stopped there. He placed the paper face down and did not continue. Whatever the palace wanted to call the situation, the statement remained deeply personal to him. Anne had spoken about a woman tied to his greatest public failure and some of his most complicated private memories. William then learned something unexpected. His father had not ordered Anne to retract the statement. He had not asked her to soften it either. That restraint unsettled the prince, because it suggested Charles was not merely angry. The monarch seemed to be wrestling with the possibility that his sister had said something painfully true. Anne refused the softer explanation when it was offered. A suggestion was made that this family could simply be interpreted as William and Harry, but she rejected it. The princess insisted she had meant the wider family. Diana's influence had reached far beyond her sons, and pretending otherwise would repeat the same mistake. Charles finally made one decision no advisor could make for him. He asked William to come and see him privately. The palace could manage headlines, wording, and schedules, but it could not manage what happened next when William walked into his father's room carrying 30 years of unanswered emotion. By the following morning, Anne's sentence had escaped the walls of Windsor and become something far larger than a family remark. Yet inside the palace, the loudest consequences were strangely quiet. William was not angry with his aunt. Charles had not condemned his sister. Instead, both men found themselves confronting memories they usually approached through duty, charity, anniversaries, and carefully chosen language. The statement had removed those protections. Diana was no longer being discussed as history. She was being felt again as family. William noticed the change almost immediately. Conversations about upcoming royal engagements continued, but the mood had shifted beneath them. Royal engagements, the official public duties carried out on behalf of the crown, were usually discussed in practical terms. Dates, speeches, travel, timing. Now every pause seemed to carry Diana's name. The prince understood why it mattered. His mother had spent years being turned into a symbol, but inside this family, she had once been a living person whose absence had never stopped shaping them. Anne refused to let the palace turn her words into a technical correction. She made it clear through a private written message to senior staff that the statement had been personal, not constitutional, and she would not allow emotion to be rewritten into bureaucratic language. The princess knew exactly what would happen if she softened it. The meaning would disappear, and Diana would once again become something carefully managed rather than honestly remembered. William received a handwritten note from his aunt later that morning. She told him she hoped her words had not caused unnecessary pain. The prince read the note once, then again, slower the second time. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket instead of leaving it behind with staff. That small decision said more than any public response could have said. He was hurt, but not by Anne. He was hurt because something buried had finally been named. Charles carried a different weight. Any response from the king would be measured against the collapse of his marriage to Diana, the years of public bitterness, and everything that followed. Yet silence carried its own danger. His sister had acknowledged something deeply human, and refusing to answer could make him appear detached from a past that had shaped his life as much as anyone else's. Anne later spoke privately with William and told him something unexpected. After their confrontation, Charles had not shouted or demanded a retraction. The monarch had simply asked whether she truly believed Diana was still loved within the family. She had answered yes without hesitation. William stopped when he heard that. For the first time, he considered that his father's question might not have been defensive at all. Perhaps Charles carried memories he had never known how to share. Perhaps silence had trapped both of them in different versions of the same grief. That evening, a direct message arrived from the king. Come alone. No aids, no briefing papers, no prepared words. For years, Diana had existed between father and son, as memory, history, and pain, but behind one closed door, she was finally about to become something far simpler. A woman they had both known and both lost. No private secretary sat beside Charles. No aide stood behind William. There were no prepared lines, no palace strategy, and no audience beyond two men linked by the same woman in completely different ways. For once, the king was simply a father, and the prince was simply a son. Anne's statement had forced them into a conversation neither could control through protocol. And when William finally spoke Diana's name, Charles did not retreat into history. He answered him personally. Charles had asked for the meeting without advisors because every formal conversation about Diana seemed to make her memory harder to reach. A private secretary, the senior aide who helps organize the monarch's official work and communications, would normally help shape sensitive discussions, but this time, the king wanted none of that. He knew the problem was no longer wording. It was distance. Years of careful language had protected the institution, but they had also protected father and son from saying what they actually felt. William arrived expecting another discussion about Anne's statement. He was prepared to hear why the wording had caused concern, why the family needed caution, and why the crown had to avoid feeding old divisions. But Charles stopped that possibility almost immediately. He told his son he had not called him there to demand a correction. He was not asking William to defend the monarchy. The prince realized then that something in his father had shifted. William finally said what had been building since Windsor. Anne's words had hurt him because they were beautiful. He had waited most of his adult life to hear someone inside the family say something so simple about Diana, without immediately surrounding her name with explanations, controversy, or regret. The prince told Charles that he had never needed anyone to pretend the past was perfect. He had only needed his mother to remain part of the family's emotional truth. Charles listened before answering. The king admitted that speaking about Diana had always felt dangerous, because every sentence seemed to become a judgment on their marriage, and on the years that followed. William did not argue with that fear. He simply told his father that silence created judgments too. For a son, silence could feel as though his mother had been carefully separated from the family she once belonged to. Charles then said the words William had never expected to hear. He had never believed Diana stopped mattering. Whatever had happened between them as husband and wife, her humanity, her motherhood, and the effect she had on the family could not be reduced to the collapse of their marriage. William asked for nothing more dramatic than honesty. He did not want history rewritten. He wanted his father to stop acting as though tenderness toward Diana threatened the life he had built afterward. Charles paused. Then he agreed. Father and son left without an embrace or a grand declaration. But the king made one decision that changed everything. Anne would not be contradicted, and Diana would be acknowledged openly at the coming family commemoration. That private agreement changed the story completely, and when the decision reached the public, Anne's sentence stopped sounding like a royal controversy and began sounding like something Britain had waited decades to hear. By sunrise, one sentence dominated the royal conversation. It was not about rank, succession, scandal, or ceremony. It was about love, and that was precisely why it struck so deeply. Anne had used a word the monarchy had rarely allowed itself to use plainly in connection with Diana. Outside the palace, people did not hear constitutional meaning. They heard a family finally admitting that a woman could leave its structure without ever leaving its emotional memory. William said nothing publicly, but his silence carried a different meaning now. The prince did not distance himself from Anne, and he supported Diana's inclusion in the coming family commemoration. A family commemoration, a private or formal gathering held to remember deceased relatives, might normally pass without national attention, but this one had become emotionally charged. His decision mattered because it showed that his aunt's words had not been rejected inside the family. Something had shifted. Charles felt that shift in a far more personal way. The king watched television coverage privately as old photographs of Diana appeared beside images of William and his children. He did not switch the screen off. He remained there, absorbing the collision between the woman he had once known, the son they had raised, and the grandchildren she had never met. For him, the past was no longer staying politely behind the present. Anne faced a different kind of pressure. Messages reached her thanking her for saying what many believed the family had avoided for years. The princess was uncomfortable with becoming the center of the story, and she told William as much in a private conversation. But she also told him that if her words had helped people remember Diana as a person rather than a permanent royal argument, then the discomfort was worth carrying. Outside Kensington Palace, the public response found its own language. A small crowd gathered near the gates, where flowers had once covered the pavement after Diana's death. Fresh white roses appeared again, but one handwritten card captured the feeling more powerfully than any headline. She was always family. Cameras recorded the message, and within hours it became the defining image of the day. Charles saw that too. The monarch understood that the reaction was no longer centered on blame. A major evening broadcast framed Anne's statement not as an attack on him, but as evidence that the royal family might finally be capable of remembering Diana without reopening every old battle. The distinction mattered. Love no longer had to mean choosing the past over the present. William heard the same framing and understood what was still missing. Public reaction had changed the tone, but it could not complete the story. Only the family itself could do that. The final test would come at the commemoration, where Charles, William, and Anne would hear Diana's name spoken openly before them all. The public had already given Anne's words its own meaning, but only one final family moment could determine whether the monarchy itself was ready to accept that meaning. There was no dramatic apology, no rewriting of history, no attempt to pretend that Diana's years inside the royal family had been simple, peaceful, or without devastating conflict. Instead, something quieter happened, and perhaps something more important. Her family finally stopped treating love and pain as opposing truths. At the commemoration, with Charles, Anne, and William sharing the same room, Diana's name was spoken without embarrassment, without defensiveness, and without anyone immediately trying to explain what remembering her was supposed to mean. William listened as the spoken tribute acknowledged his mother openly. The family commemoration, a gathering created to remember relatives who had died, now carried a meaning far deeper than ceremony. Diana was remembered not only as the mother of William and Harry, but as a woman whose humanitarian work had changed how millions saw compassion, vulnerability, and public service. For the prince, that mattered because his mother was finally being remembered as more than tragedy. She was being remembered as part of the family story. Charles did not interrupt or attempt to shape the emotion in the room. The king had already made his decision after speaking privately with William and confronting Anne. This moment would not be controlled by fear of old headlines. His silence now felt different. It was no longer avoidance. It was acceptance. William lowered his head when Diana's name was spoken. Anne looked toward him, but said nothing. Charles remained still until his son finally raised his eyes. Then the monarch gave the smallest nod. No speech followed. No explanation was needed. The gesture carried something father and son had struggled to express for years. Remembering her did not require choosing sides. Anne spoke with William afterward, and admitted she had never wanted to reopen his grief. The princess had feared that her statement might force him back into pain he had spent decades learning to carry. The prince told her it had reopened something, but not only sadness. It reminded him that Diana belonged to more memories than the terrible way her life ended. She had laughed, loved, struggled, failed, cared, and changed people. That truth mattered. Charles reached the same conclusion from another direction. Loving Diana's memory did not invalidate Camilla or erase the painful failures of the past. The king understood that memory was not a competition. One human being did not have to disappear for another to be honored. Anne's statement had separated Diana the woman from Diana the controversy. She had been loved imperfectly, hurt deeply, remembered constantly, and carried forward through her sons and grandchildren. That became the final verdict. Anne had not brought Diana back into the royal family, because she had never truly left its emotional history. William finally heard that truth acknowledged. Charles stopped treating remembrance as a threat, and the princess proved that loyalty to the crown never required silence about the woman who changed it forever. And that was the lasting force of Princess Anne's shocking sentence. Diana did not need her history rewritten to remain loved, she only needed the family she changed to finally say it aloud. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.